Hello, and welcome to another Loyalty Cup episode, Season 2.
We're back, baby.
This is a show where we load up a few topics about a movie, and then we have a long-form discussion. Before we crack into any of that, my name is Richie.
I'm Sean.
I'm Andy.
Andy, tell us about this movie.
A new film by Ari Aster, MidSommar is a fairy tale folk horror with the troubled relationship pushed to the foreground. Danny and Christian travel with a group of friends to Sweden to visit a small village and participate in a midsummer festival held once every 90 years.
Sean, tell me. Last year, you watched Hereditary, right?
Yeah.
You liked it?
I didn't think I did.
Mm-hmm.
It grew on me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We actually have a very particular relationship to Hereditary. It was our first video to really get popular.
I don't want to brag.
I do.
We spent a lot of time dissecting and
too much, man.
You made little cones for each of the characters.
We made little mock-at characters to talk about the movie.
You know, at least to say that we're paying attention to this director, right?
Yeah.
Do you think this is worthwhile follow-up?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd actually say that it's more enjoyable than Hereditary, and unfortunately, you can't talk about this movie without comparing it to Hereditary, so get ready. This is a conversation you're going to have with multiple people if you're into this movie. Compared to Hereditary, I think it's more accessible. I think it's a much more lighthearted movie than Hereditary. Funny, even at times. Beautifully shot. The subject matter isn't necessarily new, but it's refreshing. It's scary. It's not as emotionally exhausting as as Hereditary, but it is still very emotional. I wasn't as drained at the end of it. Ultimately more digestible in one sitting. You can just go and see this movie and enjoy it, I think, without having to really think too hard about it, which might be good for you. Maybe you want a little bit more meat on it, but...
I think there's meat there, though, and I think that's why I enjoyed it.
There is, but you don't necessarily need to...
Yeah, you can circumvent the meat. Mm-hmm. You know, you can eat around it. But I bit right in. I echo your thoughts completely. If there's meat in the central relationship that I really enjoyed, and I really thought, well, enjoy is a hard word to use, but really emotionally impactful, but only enough so to really have you latch onto this movie. And then what really keeps you there, and I think why it's more digestible and easier to sit through than something like Hereditary is, Hereditary had a lot of visual subtleties, and here there's no subtleties. What the characters, the actors are doing is beautiful. What the music is doing is beautiful. What the colors are doing, it's jaw-dropping all through. Yeah, I really like this movie.
Yeah, I agree with both of you guys. I think the film is emotionally impactful from a horror film standpoint. There's a lot of scary things that happen both on screen and from the psychological viewpoint. When compared to Ari Aster's previous kind of blockbuster hit, Hereditary, this may not be as shocking in terms of visual things. It definitely has some shocking visual horror aspects, but it kind of deals more with what's going on in the mind and the paranoia of the characters. And the interesting thing is, Hereditary, there was a huge payoff with psychological dread early on in the film. This movie does something similar even earlier, and that compounds the motivations of the main character so early on, and that kind of changes the pace of the film. Horror audiences are going to go into it with expectations that are going to be shattered pretty quick. I have a few gripes that we can talk about later, but yeah, I think overall I enjoyed it.
So yeah, let's get into it. Let's start on the visuals. Andy.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing was, one of the main motivations of the main character is finding out that her mother and sister died through a murder-suicide. Beautifully set up for, it almost looks like a continuous shot with a few cuts to body bags being zipped up, and then
because it starts downstairs,
yeah.
Right, and then it smoothly
transitions.
Yeah. It reminded me a lot of David Fincher, actually.
It almost looks CGI.
Absolutely.
And the coloring, the colorization, the lighting, everything was so gorgeous. And then the camera goes out into the snowy night, and it cuts to the credits. In the theater, my jaw had dropped, and I was like, holy hell, This is unreal. And whereas in Hereditary, it took about a half hour to 45 minutes to get to that crux of the film. Mm-hmm. He does it in the first 10 minutes, and that sets up the motivations for Danny as to why this whole movie unfolds.
It's almost eternally night when they're in college. When they finally get out to Sweden, you're in broad daylight for almost the rest of the movie.
Yeah.
And that's where we're really burying the lead there, because it's once you get to Sweden, everything seems like exposure's up like a half step, maybe more than it really should be, but everything's glowing a little bit.
It looks unnatural.
Hopeful. Yeah.
It looks unnaturally just beautiful and bright.
It looks like there's light from all sides. It almost looks like there's no shadows. There probably were, but it looks overexposed in some scenes.
The colors are all really bright and vibrant. There's green and blue everywhere, which is not something you're used to seeing in any horror movie. You're actually, the way that it's presented, you don't see it in most movies at all. You know?
And I was really worried that was going to be a gimmick, watching the trailer and being like, oh, it's a horror film shot in the day. And it's like, it is, but as a service to the plot, not necessarily as like a plot device or anything like that. It's just the setting is daytime and just...
Yeah, it had almost nothing to do with the plot itself, and it had a lot more to do with the environment, the setting, the people that are involved in that place.
But then the way they use it to kind of prey on the fears and paranoia of the characters, like even when they go into their dormitory and they close the shades, because at night when they go to sleep, it's still broad daylight outside. And
it's also like a psychedelic movie, right?
Yeah.
So all this brightness just sets the score or sets the scene for them to hallucinate really hard throughout the whole movie. Whereas Mandy was also kind of a psychedelic film, but very nighttime, very hazy. It's like being in a room with the curtains drawn and tripping. This is the complete opposite, where you're outside in nature, everything is breathing, everything is extra vibrant.
It culminates all those things, right, in a way that's like, you're in a new place, your character's in a new environment. It feels new, it's overexposed, all of these things joining together. And I think that they really all kind of come to like a peak when you get into these rituals. And I really think the rituals is where it's at in this movie. it's where it's at. For me, it's the movie. You get to them, they're visually stunning. You're already kind of in a hypnotic state because of everything that's led up to it, but you're still invested in what's going to happen with the characters. So when you get kind of thrown into that whirlpool, you kind of don't want to get out. Being visually arrested while that's going on is, I don't know. I just loved that. I just loved it.
Well, it was immersive. I mean, you get in there and not only is the environment completely different, so are everyone is dressed in a weird way. It's just very theatrical. Down to what everyone's wearing, you know, it seems kind of
like a pageant.
Yeah, it's like you joined a play that you didn't know you were a part of.
Yeah.
And before we get more into the plot points, I want to acknowledge how much of an accomplishment it is for the director Ari Aster and the cinematographer Pawel Pogorzelski to pull off a film like this in broad daylight and still have horror aspects and paranoia aspects and sheer terror and fear when you have unending light and you can't really hide things in shadows. So many horror films rely on jump scares and things coming out of the shadows and out of the darkness to hide the seams of things and hide the monsters coming out of the shadows. They don't have that luxury.
Yeah, and building off of that, I think it is one of the themes just overall is not hiding. You're unable to hide in this movie. Even the room where they all sleep together. The second story is a square so that you can see inside. There's no hiding anywhere, even in the buildings. The building, you can see the second floor from wherever you stand. Everything's wide out in the open. Even when Danny is hallucinating and trying to run away, she has nowhere to run because she's just out there. Even when she goes in the outhouse, she runs out.
Yeah, you could spot her from wherever. Like,
and
like
everywhere,
we could see where you're going.
Yeah, she's just zigzagging in this open meadow and realizing that she has nowhere to go, so she bolts into the forest. It's that kind of idea that everyone here, their security comes from themselves and each other, not necessarily hiding behind anything.
It's kind of woven into the fabric of this movie, how everything is laid out open for you. It's not trying to jump out and spook you. It's trying to, crawl under your skin. And
very early on, once they get to this village, one of the first ceremonial parts of the festivity is the two elders committing suicide, and everyone's there to witness it. And it's a celebration. It's not anything dreadful. It's the circle of life for them. The grief and the shock of the American visitors is addressed, and they say, well, this is tragedy to you, but this is a celebration for us. And I think that is really, it's kind of that enemy of kind of cultural woes and expectations.
Yeah, whereas Hereditary was more of a horror told through grief and loss. This is, culture as horror.
What it does do, though, is that it gives you this bedrock of our main characters. And if Ari Aster is a pro at anything, I think it is investing you in the relationship of those initial characters you start off with. Every horror movie you start out with, they're bros or like teenagers that you just hate. Like, I always hate the main characters.
And they all die.
But in this one, I have an attachment to the relationship that's going on, and the relationship's not working out so hot. And then it gets worse when the parents die. And you're mixed with all these complexities, and you're mixed with all this vulnerability. And And having that bedrock of like vulnerability and then throwing somebody into an environment where people just jump off of cliffs, it sets you into a delirium, and the character's into a delirium.
Well, and what I love about that is that this is a life-changing point for Danny's life. She's vulnerable, she's susceptible. Pele, the character who's inviting them all to his little festivity, this is sort of an analogy for modern cults. They recruit people to modern cults when you're at a point in your life where you're susceptible and vulnerable.
And one thing that I think a lot of these horror movies always kind of have a misstep on is that the characters stay in the scenario way longer than any reasonable person ever would. Mm-hmm. And what this movie does really well is it convinces you that two of them are working on their thesis, which is, if you've known anybody or ever been in that situation, it is a really huge deal, and you do unreasonable things to work on your thesis. And so I bought into that, like, yeah, they're going to stick around a little longer and understand this culture, right? Then you introduce more of the drugs. I think the combination of those two things really helped me suspend disbelief, because I felt like, yeah, I mean, if I got drugged out and I were there for my thesis, I'd probably stick around a little bit longer than what would seem normal.
I think if you want to look at this movie as a relationship drama with the kind of structure of a horror film or folk horror film around it, and you look at her relationship drama breaking apart after the death of her family, and then she had a rocky relationship, but then, and if it was just that, no normal person would probably send her ex-boyfriend off to burn. But because she's been taken into this commune and she's been given all these drugs, and then coincidentally made the queen of their village. Mm-hmm. Now she has this newfound confidence, and they're cheering her on. They're celebrating her as the queen, which in her prior life, she probably was never celebrated. And now she literally has a new family. She's watching all her friends be murdered off one by one. And she's probably not totally ignorant to that.
And then you have the other couple, Connie and Simon, react, I think, as the audience is supposed to.
Yeah, they're probably the actual closest to audience surrogate.
Whereas Danny reacts as basically going into shock and shutting down. Mm-hmm. And she tries to run away again, but she has nowhere to go. So she breaks down in the field and just starts crying. And then she gets over it. That's her character. She's used to being given a lot of tragedy to deal with in her life.
Zero support.
Zero support. And so hers is just, her reaction to it is be like, all right, I have to get over this and then just get along with everyone else, because their life doesn't stop for me. I've got to this is me overreacting. It might be a defense to her to just tell herself that she is overreacting to the situation.
Because you're right. There's some sort of almost like psychosis going on with her. But there's also huge emotional instability. So you combine those two things with what is on its face the familial support of this cult or society, right? Because they do start embracing her. They do start calling her family. And Pele Le Pew starts squirting his love dust, and he starts flirting with her. And so it's like all these things in combination have her completely mystified by what's going on around her. Whether or not she loses her mind, she's in it. To me, it looks like she's losing her mind.
She is quick to apologize and take everything as her fault. But then also one of the women, when she goes to make the meat pies, says, you're beautiful. She says, you're beautiful. And she's like, oh, you're beautiful too. And it's like, no, she's not. She's an old woman.
They also are very intentional in her costuming this is a rare, beautiful woman.
They make her frumpy.
They make her frumpy as hell. To the point where it's not great in this
one. I wondered about that too, and I appreciated it. But then, if you think about it just a little bit more, you're like, all right, I get getting on a plane. You're going to wear your comfy clothes, but
she's in her comfies the whole movie. And we get that she's mourning, but I mean, it's a movie. And in the movie, what we're used to is having that main girl, you make her a babe so it's easy on the eyes or something. And they're not trying to do that on this movie. It's all about the character and what the character is going through. You can see it on her.
Yeah, she definitely looks like it's Saturday morning every day.
And she's waiting for Digimon to come on.
Yeah, she's just like, what are we doing?
So interestingly, after the first time they arrive and they take mushrooms, she leaves her group, right? And one of the local commune people looks at her and says something to the effect of, oh, look, a new person. And I immediately thought they were just showing that there's a new tourist or a new person visiting, right? But it's interesting that with heavy drug use, a lot of people attribute depersonalization as a trait, literally either not knowing who you are or turning into someone else, almost like multiple personality, is almost supported through her character change throughout the film.
Yeah, it's somewhat disassociative, right? Yeah. We do see her take, I believe it's Ativan, when she's talking to her friend about Christian, which is a benzo habit forming. And I don't think you can necessarily just quit taking that. And we never see it again. It's outside of taking like an Ambien from Josh. She never talks about her prescription, about needing that. And I think it's a little strange. So I'm wondering if there is something there about maybe benzo withdrawal.
So I think on that, we can jump into some of the themes. And if I had one really major bone to pick with this movie, I didn't totally feel comfortable with using mental illness or mental disorder or disability. I'm not sure if I know exactly what word to use. And I'm not probably the guy who should be the representative of this, but I just feel like using it as whatever one of those things equals spooky scary feels really inappropriate.
And
you
exploitative.
do it and exploitative. This movie's like, well, the bipolar character right off the bat is made to seem like a drag, but then she becomes murderous. This movie doesn't represent everything, but it means that if somebody goes in, isn't well educated or doesn't know exactly what's going on, they take it as a broad stroke and they see somebody who is bipolar on a film represented as somebody who will murder your family.
It's kind of an old-fashioned take on mental illness.
Absolutely.
Right? Which is kind of weird in a movie that came out this year.
Considering how progressive of a movie studio A24 is too, the sort of things that they're putting out, I think they really are thoughtful about the sort of social
you would
moments,
assume,
right?
You would think. But going back to Hereditary, I've had multiple people talk to me about that movie and just say, I think it was kind of tacky how they just made, what's her name, a little frumpy and slow. It was that in order
Charlie.
to make it easier to digest her death. Like if
and she was demonic. Keep that in mind. Somebody who is frumpy or slow or maybe mentally disabled can be demonic is kind of what that equates to.
Yeah, and it kind of adds... just a villain to a situation that doesn't have one otherwise.
You get it again in this movie, though, where you have a character who, through inbreeding, is... things are not good for this character, though. And we don't dive into this character at all or get to know any more around it or about it, except that we get flashes of this character, and that's just supposed to feel heebie-jeebie. And that feels extremely inappropriate.
The problem, too, is in this film, they use that character in the trailer almost as a selling point for the film as it being in the horror genre. And then, furthermore, they use that character on the cover of Fangoria magazine.
And it just feels exploitative.
It totally is exploitative. And the thing is, too, from a horror film standpoint, if Danny's sister was not acknowledged to be bipolar, that would have been 10 times more frightening.
And it also
creates all these issues you two just acknowledged.
And it also doesn't really even matter. Like, it was just a beeline to her tragedy, right? And it just kind of gave you a reason to, again, something that Ari Aster does well, is get these chilling performances from women basically going hysterical.
Screeching.
Yeah, in ways I've never heard of in a movie before. The first time was in Hereditary, and it shook me to this day. Yeah. And now we get it again, a separate performance, equally as chilling. But it seemed like it was just a vehicle for us to see that. It's super glossed over that she's bipolar and she killed her parents. I mean,
it feels like lazy writing. That's what it feels like.
Yeah, because it does give you like horror. Yeah, it gives you horrifying images throughout the rest of the movie to kind of call back on when she's having a dream and the exhaust pours out of her mouth.
Which is awesome.
Yeah, I mean, you could do tragedy without blaming it on mental illness.
That's it.
And on the flip side, if it is influenced by personal family drama or tragedy or whatever it is, and you want to acknowledge that, don't do it in a soft way. Acknowledge it in some way that influences the filmmaking and the writing in a more direct way.
I guess to dive into it.
I think they used the word bipolar once and they said, well, she's bipolar. And that created the excuse for the actions. And that's kind of a terrible out.
Yeah. It's shorthand for she could do anything.
Whereas if the film were, like there's a movie, The Exploding Girl, about epileptic main lead, and she has epilepsy, and it shows how it affects her relationships with her boyfriend and her family, and the movie's called The Exploding Girl, that relates to her epilepsy. That movie is about a physical condition and how it changes the lives of people. This movie is not about being bipolar and how it changed the lives of people. They use that word once, and it's supposed to inform the film, but it does it poorly, and it does it in an exploitative fashion.
Outside of the things we're angry at, what other takeaways are there from this movie? Because there are other takeaways. This does feel like a relationship put up into different tableaus or vignettes, and each of these vignettes almost make pageantry out of each moment in the relationship, right? You have this central tension, and then you have the infidelity, and then you have the moment where the main character turns and decides to kill him.
After becoming queen.
And in a movie where it wasn't from Ari Aster, it would be her, slashing this guy to death. But in this movie, she points after she's been crowned by flowers, and they ceremoniously burn him along with all these other sigils and people and animals and beautiful music, beautiful performances, and beautiful pit of fire. I mean, that to me was my huge takeaway. I felt like I was watching a extremely elevated breakup and an extremely elevated kind of mental downfall of our main character.
There's also kind of like these little sub-themes that I think all good horror movies should have. Because this movie is very much on the surface. It tells a cool story and with good pacing, but there are some other little things that are fun to kind of dig at and see if there's any special meaning, especially in a movie where you can't read the runes. There's language going on all around you that you can't decipher. So with that, I think are inherently instances of metaphor. So for me, I had some fun just kind of goofing around because you've got this pagan community, right? You have a white man from America named Christian. The conflict between pagans and Christians, I mean, you kind of have to wonder what is he saying about that? You know, what does that mean? It's too on the nose just to be a white man named Christian in a pagan village. For me, that represents obviously Christians, you know, American Christians, and how they will mingle in with these pagan societies, take what they can to benefit themselves from it. So you have Christian, represents Christian culture. Josh, who represents science.
Or academia or something.
And then you have Mark, who's there just as literally the fool, entertainment. You take those, you put them into the temple to burn as a sacrifice, right? You have to be willing to volunteer yourself and also sacrifice some of your people in order to benefit the greater good. So I think there was something kind of weird and subversive about that message.
Or at the very least, what you're watching is like playing out of all those forces and what the pagan side of that metaphor would really want to do or play out if they could.
How do we stab back at these cultures that exploit and
marginalize us, really?
Right. And how can we subvert that, you know, in a way that benefits their cause, which I thought was pretty sick.
And on your note of connections and like the end birding scene, I think it was Mark, he was wearing a jester's cap at the end. And earlier on in the film, obviously he was a joke of the whole movie, but they were playing the game Skin the Fool. Was his face also the one that was being worn as a mask?
Yeah, and that, I would, you know, when you watch it, you just see a man wearing Mark's skin, you know, but in the script, it actually tells you that I think it's Ulf, the man who was really upset that he peed on his tree. And also the father of the daughter who lures him out into the woods to show him. He's also one of the volunteers to be burnt. Maybe there's some type of weird connection there.
You know, when you read about this movie online, a lot of people will compare sort of the existential dread to Ingmar Bergman's films. He's also Swedish, so there's that connection there. I do think that there's intentionality in that because one of the characters is actually named, and they make him repeat the name, I think, is Ingmar. So
yeah, his Pele's brother.
Pele's brother.
Who was also
sacrificed.
Yeah, he sacrificed himself.
If, you know, make of that what you will, but I do think there's interconnection in that. But I do think thematically it also has a lot to do with the same sort of ideas that Ingmar Bergman's films have. I think, what does it mean to treat kind of that circle of life differently than other people? And that this clash of culture, I think, really kind of makes those ideas float around.
Much like Hereditary and all these new kind of horror movies, it gets me excited for what is going to come next. Because the horror genre has, you know, been stale for a really long time and started just relying on shock and gore for a while. Too long, really. Whereas this has that, it takes it further. You know, there's nothing quite like seeing a man free fall straight onto his legs and shatter them.
Like an Olympic diver.
And then not die.
And
then have his head bashed in by a cartoony hammer.
Like 3 times.
Yeah.
Having his wife or the woman smash her face on a rock, and then you just keep getting shown that. It's like, yeah, we can do this, but we can take it further. We can also give you a good story and overall a good movie-going experience. The hallucinatory effects were great in this movie, which can be said about a lot of movies that rely on that for visual effect. It wasn't overdone. Again, nothing in here was really overdone. It all kind of played its part and let the movie kind of take the forefront, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It would subtle hallucinatory effects just matched with the vibrancy of the scenery, the costumes, just the characters themselves, just really helped elevate this a little bit higher than your standard horror film. So if Ari Aster can continue doing this, I'll watch every movie he makes, you know, and I hope other people kind of take note in a way that I think they did after Hereditary, which is kind of keep trying to push the horror genre into just new realms, get people out of a scary house and keep them from having to run from a named enemy, put them in more situations like this where the environment is the horror and your own mind is the horror, and how do you deal with that? Because I think that will speak to a lot more people in a more introspective way. How much of horror is of your own creating? How much of it is in your mind and how you deal with it? It takes that ritual horror theme that you've kind of been seeing in the forefront for the past few years and kind of turns it a little bit sideways. And I appreciated that.
Yeah, mirroring basically everything that you're saying, I do think that this is not just a genre bender, but a pusher, but also just on a technical basis. If I'm going to sit in that chair for 2.5 hours, I do want to be stunned by the visuals. I do want the soundtrack to just wash over me. And this movie had me transfixed. It had me completely hypnotized from the moment they land in Sweden.
Yeah, it's an experience. It's immersive.
I agree with all of that. I think a lot of people can easily call it a horror film, but that would kind of dilute what it actually is. The cool thing is it's very coded. I don't know what you're shaking your head about.
Because why does it calling it horror,
horror
immediately?
Movie, it's a bad word.
No, it's not that it's bad. It's just it almost ignores everything else it is doing.
I kind of agree with you.
That's what I mean by that. So it definitely is a horror film, but it goes beyond that.
Because it's also like my favorite art film of this year.
Yeah. It goes beyond the horror film. That's what I meant by that. It has a lot of cool kind of hidden Easter eggs if you're watching it casually, like bear painting, the skin the cat, the gesture hat, the dormitory, all that fun stuff you can pick up on the first viewing and the second viewing. And then I'm sure if you watch it a few more times, there's probably more things that, you'll miss the first few times too.
We do not review every movie that comes out. We review the movies that we want to talk about, that we're excited about talking about. For that reason, you're not going to see a video every week. Really important that if you subscribe, thank you, but hit the bell too. The bell's going to let you know every time we upload a new video.
We get excited about different movies, and so we want to know between the three of us. And so we want to know what you guys are excited about. What do you want to see covered? It might help make that decision for us if we know that you guys want to see something covered. So let us know.
You can leave that stuff in the comments, or you can find us on @LoyaltyCup on Instagram, and that's how you're going to be able to find out anything that we got coming up next. That's going to wrap it up. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Good night.